All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Vincent. We have Miles and Morgan Hayduk on the podcast today. Morgan, you mind to introduce
Of
yourself?
course. Thank you for having me. So my name is Morgan Hayduk. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of Beatdapp. We find streaming fraud and stop it before fraudsters make money. That's really the name of the game. And so we've been at this for 6 years as a business, but really the last 3.5 focused on fraud after realizing that this was a major problem plaguing the music industry. And no one had really created a standardized solution to detect and prevent payouts from going to fraudsters. And so our sort of animating motivation as a business is we all know how hard it is to make money from your art and as a musician. And you're always competing against every other legitimate artist. And that's great. That competition is healthy. But what we don't want to see is a world where they're competing against motivated fraudsters who are there solely to drain the pool of money from which they're paid for streaming. And so as a business, we've really geared ourselves around making sure that every legitimate artist is paid fairly and correctly for their work, which dovetails nicely with what you do. We're upstream from payouts, but if we get things wrong, payouts are incorrect. And if we get things right, then the folks on the receiving end of those payments get paid more and get paid fairly. And that to me is part of a healthy, vibrant, competitive music industry.
100%. It dovetails so nicely with what Trolley does. Like you said, we were chatting about that. We get the signals that we need to pay this person or this entity or this ID in the database, but we're so excited to speak with you guys to better understand what you guys do because you're fighting to get the money in the right hands, and we're all about that as well. So before we dive into Beatdapp and then what you guys do, the future, what you're thinking about in terms of next years or so, tell us a little bit more about your background and how did you guys come about to create this company?
Yeah, it's one of those stories that makes complete sense in retrospect, but was never the plan.
The classic founder story, you mean?
Exactly. Everything's clear through the rear view. So I started my career very fortunately with music as my first client. I was a consultant in the government relations or lobbying world in Ottawa. And I had 2 clients when I started. One was Music Canada. So they're the trade association that represents the major labels here in Canada. And then Entertainment One, which had a big music label, a big indie label at the time. And so I got exposed really early on to the soup sandwich that is copyright and how just confusing and challenging and, just difficult to navigate, payouts and ownership and everything really is. And in Canada, we were trying to extend the period that artists own their copyrights from 50 to 70 years to align with sort of international norms. And we were successful in that. And so I got a front row seat for the business of music. It's probably the less sexy and less glamorous side of the industry, but it was a really good illustration of how important it is to understand really how money flows through the industry and where the bottlenecks and the constraints are. And so I did that. And then another one of my clients was TELUS, and TELUS brought me in-house. And so I was really away from music for a while. I was working on telco policy in Canada, which is arguably even less glamorous, but also necessary. And so I did that. And then my wife and I had the opportunity to move out to Los Angeles. And so we moved to LA for 5 years and working in marketing. And I was at a company called ZipRecruiter. It was great. It gave me some exposure to a very different set of tools and a craft, but I always had the bug to build something and to start something. I come from an entrepreneurial family and my dad ran a small business. And I always enjoyed sort of both building and being part of small teams that were super focused on a problem and solving it. Even the agency that I worked for, it was a small consulting firm within TELUS. We were a very small government relations team that functioned with a lot of autonomy relative to the bigger sort of corporate empire. That was always there. It just so happened that one of my early clients in the music industry was in his office in LA one day chatting and kind of pointed me in a direction, called Andrew, my co-founder, and him and I ended up meeting with the folks from E1 and having a conversation about a problem they were encountering, which was around the auditability of records that were coming from the platforms where they were collecting all this streaming revenue. And so Andrew and I had met in grad school. We'd been friends for a decade, always knew that if we were going to build something, we probably wanted to build something together, and had that moment of like, I think there's something here. In the grand history of Beatdapp, that I think something here, at least here moment, actually wasn't the right problem to solve at the time. But we ran it down, and the idea of building auditing technology for streaming services that would serve music labels had enough legs that we were able to sort of start to build the shell of a business around it and validate the idea. And so that happened, obviously made the plunge, jumped in full time to Beatdapp, and started having conversations with streaming services around this sort of first idea, this auditing product that we thought was super clever. They weren't sold, to say it kindly, that they needed to be audited more efficiently. I think that's probably the natural reflex of everybody who hears the auditors are coming. Even the friendly Canadian auditors, they're still not super stoked. But we kept pressing, and we really wanted to run down this notion of there was a discrepancy between what would show up on a server log and what would show up in a sales report and why that existed. And we started to hear from DSPs the same thing, but said differently every time. And that was streaming fraud. So we heard spin manipulation, spin juicing, stream fraud, stream manipulation, artificial streaming, outright fraud, you name it, botting, any kind of, name you can imagine. But what occurred to us in that moment was everyone's describing the same problem, but they have no shared vocabulary for this. They're not talking about a solution that they're currently using to deal with over and over and over again, reiterating the existence of this problem that up to that point, we'd never really heard before. And it's certainly, this is 2020, 2021. Like, no one was talking about streaming fraud publicly. It was more than the sort of scarlet letter. It was almost unheard of. Although now, having done this for a while, we realized that there were lots of conversations happening very quietly within certain organizations, but nothing had actually sort of manifested as a solution to this problem. And so after we heard it, 5, 6, 7 times, we went, I think this is the thing we need to solve for, because if you have fraud in a system, auditability is not the problem. Auditability comes after making sure that you have the correct records to pay out on in the first place. And if you can't get that right, what are you auditing? And so we really reoriented the business around that. We were fortunate to get a data set from an early partner of ours who said, we think we have a fraud problem. We really don't have the capacity in-house to deal with this in a, systematic and advanced sort of way.
Must have been a key moment for you guys to get that, pass on the tape, as we say as Canadians.
Yes, exactly. Right where the puck was going, which was great.
Yep.
And that sort of led us to building Beatdapp. And so we started from there. And it was, I think, without that moment of both seeing that there was this problem and then having a partner who was willing to say, have a look at our data, which, by the way, is fairly sensitive first party data. We can talk more about what specifically we look at, but it wasn't an easy ask. And so I'm ever thankful. And then also that we had an incredible technical team who, when we said, okay, we're not going to do this auditing thing anymore, we're going to build machine learning models to find fraud, they went, cool, let's do that. And they're incredibly gifted and were
great pivot right there.
Exactly. Yep. So anyway, that's the abridged version of the history.
Maybe for me and for the audience is, what is spin manipulation? When you say that, I go, okay, I think I understand, but what's going on when someone's manipulating streams?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's sort of 2 ways to come at the answer. Also, generally, fraud on the internet and probably fraud off the internet is basically a tale as old as the technology, right? From the day that there was an ad platform from Google, there were folks trying to arbitrage and defraud AdWords. E-commerce has had the same problem. If you read the book on the founding of PayPal, one of the earliest chapters is them standing up their fraud detection team in, I think, North Dakota or South Dakota, because they were just getting scammed like crazy. So as soon as you build a platform that's consumer facing, that has some financial payout associated with it, there are clever, sophisticated folks, some who are gamers and sort of individuals who just realize there's an opportunity to do some sort of arbitrage here, and some who are more sophisticated, the organized crime types. You realize if there's enough money in the pot, they can make real money or launder real money. So what happened with streaming, it's sort of no different than any of those platforms. A little different spin on the ball, but very similar conceptually. If you think about how the sort of mechanics of streaming and payouts work, if you own a song, let's just assume in this case you own the master and publishing, and you use an independent distributor, put your music onto Spotify or Apple or Amazon or SoundCloud, you name it, pick your platform. Every time that song is played, it's calculated against the sort of total percentage of streams for that period. And because the money is distributed pro rata, you receive proportionally what you deserve based on how much your song was played in the context of the entire period's plays.
Which, by the way, to me is a bit crazy. And that's why we love initiatives like SoundCloud for artists that are geared more towards hey, we're going to pay you based on how much your fans are listening to your stuff. But That's a separate conversation.
Oh no, I want to go there. We should talk about this. We'll use the pro rata illustration because that's the dominant sort of payout method. And then I'll talk about user-centric and fan-powered royalties and those things as well. But in the pro rata model, you own the copyright, you put it onto a platform, it's received some plays, you get paid a little bit of money. For clever fraudsters, what they realized is, and it's always arbitraging something that was created with good intent, right? The pro rata system was created because it was simple and people weren't sure if this streaming thing was even going to be a thing, right? Like when streaming started to sort of blossom, we're coming off a historic downturn in the music industry and an appreciable level of fear that digital was not the future. And so they made the pro rata system because it was pretty easy, right, to start. Now as the industry has matured and payout models are maturing and we sort of all collectively realize this is sort of the dominant mode of consumption, there's a lot of tinkering to do on the margins. So that's where sort of pro rata came from. And so for clever fraudsters, what they would do is they would go, all right, so if I can get my hands on a bunch of songs, which isn't that hard to do, and I can put them onto streaming services because distribution exists for the benefit of independent creators who don't have a label deal and their own access to the labels channels onto the platforms. And I can run some bots or I can hijack some accounts. I can actually drive a fair amount of volume to my songs. And so the earliest versions of this were just people running bot farms the same way they were elsewhere, targeting their own music. Fraud is one of these things where it's a perpetual game of whack-a-mole. My overarching theory of fraud is that it is incredibly lazy at the beginning and then gets progressively more sophisticated with every time the fraudster gets caught. Right. And so what we've seen over the last number of years is just people iterating on the original sort of design of streaming farms to be more sophisticated and to hide what they're doing amidst the sort of mass of streaming that exists across all these platforms.
And that last point there, it's like the better locks make better criminals sort of mentality, where as they're getting caught, they still want to make sure that they're finding ways. I remember the days where people were saying like, oh, if you like a band, like just put them on play and turn the volume off and leave it play overnight. Is this the type of stuff at like a mass scale that was happening that you're talking about, which was like bots doing this, like not even humans, but bots listening to tracks and albums over and over again so that someone got paid?
Yeah, so I think there's a great example from a band called Wolfpack that created a sleepy album. I think it was like 14 31-second songs, and they told their fans, if you just play this while you sleep, we'll make some money, and then we'll go on tour and we'll make the tickets free. And it worked. They made enough money to make their next tour. It might have been only a few shows, but they were able to subsidize their tour by making a completely blank album. That is it's a hilarious example. And it's probably a no-no from like a platform's perspective, but that's not really the problem that we encounter. The thing that's been the most encouraging, it's a weird thing to describe as encouraging, but I think for me, it's really encouraging. We don't catch a lot of legitimate artists engaging in streaming fraud. There are some, it happens from time to time. People engage a marketing firm that they think is legit and they're actually just buying plays unbeknownst to them. Right. And I always say to artists and managers and anybody who's in like the sort of legit music community, if it seems too good to be true when it comes to marketing, it probably is. Ask for references. If they guarantee you plays, if they guarantee you, placement on the top of an editorial playlist, those things you can't buy them that way. More than 80%, and I would guess probably more than 90% of what we see is more just purely financially motivated fraud. Most of what we actually find being listened to by these bot farms doesn't even fall in the not great music quality bucket. It's just noise, sounds, generative works of, steel pipes clanging together, whale sounds, fuzz, you name it. It doesn't matter what the content is. They just amassed a catalog that they can put onto the platforms and target with their bots. And they're only in it for one of two reasons. One is to make money and the other is to clean money. And so at, criminal scale, there's obviously, as we saw in the indictment last week, there is ROI to streaming fraud. I mean, if the allegations are true, Michael Smith invested 1.3 million in his accounts and made 10 million over 6 years. Pretty good ROI. I think that's probably enticing for someone who has a criminal bent to them. And then the cleaning money side is, if you have a dirty dollar and you can get 60 clean cents out the other side, that's actually also a positive ROI. So that's really what we're seeing at scale, is not artists who are trying to appear more popular than they are. It's really just folks who are trying to hide in the long tail and make as much money as they possibly can.
Yeah, so I guess it's not criminal artists, but music being a vehicle to make or clean dollars.
Yeah. And what's good, once you realize that, and like for us, the sort of the moment that was great is realizing in that first data set what we're seeing are not artists, are not labels, are not like sort of legitimate music industry participants engaging in this, which basically puts everybody in the industry on the same side of the table. And that's very rare in music. There are very few business cases where you can say streaming service, label, artist, manager, lawyer, upstream payment provider, all on the same
Right.
side of the table trying to solve a problem. And in this case, we actually have that.
It's great to see in the industry. So want to double click now on, obviously if you don't want revealing too much of the secret sauce, but how does Beatdapp attack this problem? And like, we're tech guys, we love tech and all that. Can you explain a little bit like how it works and how we Trolley receive the right payouts now, because it has been screened and audited and whatever the terms you guys use to define this, to detect the right fraud? How does this work?
I mean, it's way beyond my technical experience to explain the models. What I will say is that, we're a machine learning company. Sam Altman has rebranded all of machine learning to AI, and now everybody is an AI company, which, maybe that's true, but I think of us as a machine learning company. But really what we're doing is we're looking at all of the signals that a platform collects on every stream and on every user as they're interacting with the platform and consuming music. So when we get data from a customer, what we're getting is what was listened to and all of the associated metadata. So who's the artist, featured artist, track, name, album name, all the sort of standard metadata. And then we also receive all of the user behavioral data for that period as well. The one thing we don't take, or the two things we don't take, are actual usernames. We don't need to know who the user is specifically. And we take the hash of the IP address so that we don't have to deal with some of the PII implications, like person identifying information implications of collecting actual user data. But we get things like, how many clicks does that user take to navigate from the home screen to the track they want to listen to, and what device type are they on, and what device model are they on, and are they passively or actively consuming that music? Is it a playlist that they're listening to on the screen with the screen behind them, or are they up like leaning in and actually selecting songs? All of those signals, we take all of that in, and then we run our models sort of 4 levels. So at the highest level of sort of aggregation, we're looking at the artist. How does, what happens with this artist's music? We look at all the tracks associated with that artist. Then we look at all the users, and then we look at all the devices associated with those users. And the device model to me is really the key unlock for us, because it's one thing to see, artists tracks interacting in a weird way with different users and showing up on the same playlists and having user behaviors that are sort of sporadic or very intent. That's all fine. But what you really want to get to, I think, in my view, is a place where you can distinguish between what is a bot and what is an account that's been compromised, i.e. like your password has shown up somewhere else on the internet in the data breach, and now I have control of your streaming service account. And so our device model lets us do that. But if we were looking at, like, I'll use just you as an example, Myles, like if we're looking at your account, you may have 5 registered devices, 3 of which are iOS, and they all behave predictably and similarly. But then you have 2 Linux devices hanging sort of over here that are listening to completely different stuff with very different patterns of behavior, probably from different locations than where the other 3 show up. And also all of that music that your 2 Linux devices are listening to are the same as these 17,000 other Linux devices associated with all these other users over here. And the commonality is, what you're listening to and the pattern between how you engage that content. And so that gives us the ability to say, okay, this is a real user and his account isn't compromised. And so for our clients, we're able to say to them, here's a list every month of every account that we suspect is compromised. You should force reset the passwords on all of these and see what happens, the next day in terms of whether those devices all get re-registered and whether the listening pattern changes. And then for the ones that are just behaving like bots, we're able to say, here's your bot accounts. You can do 2 things with this. One is you can demonetize all of the streams, so make sure none of these get paid. And the second is you can decide whether you want to kick the account off the platform altogether, or you can keep the accounts live, especially if they're paying a premium subscription, and see how long it takes them to realize their checks have stopped coming. And in the meantime, you can keep that user.
Could take a while, I imagine.
Yeah, 30% take more than 4 months to realize they haven't been paid.
Just shows that total bots, like with massive amount of bots and accounts and stuff like that, and then takes a while before they ID that they're not getting any money anymore.
Exactly. Which is good. It's actually one of the beauties of the payout model. I mean, I think there's certainly from the artist perspective, it's frustrating that you have to wait a while to get paid monthly at the soonest, and sometimes quarterly or every half a year, every year, depending on which CMO, PRO you're collecting on the pub side group. But that lag in payouts is what really lets a company like ours work in the background and make sure that we're getting to your earlier question. Are we sure that these are the people who deserve to be paid for the period and these are the fraudsters? If you had to do it in real time, it's a little bit harder because you just don't have as much time series data to analyze.
And I'm guessing because it's a learning model, it gets better every day. So the more the company works with you guys, the better their detection will be.
And it works, in two ways. One is for the individual customers model, but then with every new customer, the data set that we analyze gets larger, the patterns that we see become more apparent, or we find unique edge cases on one platform that we can go check on all of the others to see if there's similarity or an exact pattern match. And just like for context, there was 4.1 trillion streams last year in the music industry, and we looked at about 2.5 trillion of them. So we have a pretty good sense of what's going on across the industry.
Yeah.
Good data set for sure.
So you were mentioning bots, and there's I guess one of the questions that I'm thinking about is around AI, and a bot a couple of years ago was something that you would I think it was pretty stupid when you talk about bots, set them on a certain way. You mentioned generative AI in there, able to adapt, able to change patterns. How are you working in the new reality that we've been exposed to in the last 12 to 18 months?
It's a great question. And it's you're exactly right. I think the limiting factor in running a high ROI streaming farm used to be access to material, right? It was access to actual songs. If you look at the Michael Smith indictment, he had hundreds of thousands of songs apparently. And AI in a lot of ways will, facilitate that scale. Now, I think it's maybe a bad analogy, but I think about it like the person who invented the hammer, a ton of great utility, but also can be used for crime. AI music, we're not putting that genie back in the bottle, and nor should we. I think there will be some incredible additive beneficial outcomes from bringing AI tools into the studio, into the recording process. AI generative artists are a thing that we will talk about in the future, and that's not going away. But from my perspective, we have to be very mindful that those same tools can be used with ill intent, and they clearly are, and that will also not sort of stop. When you have 250,000 songs a day or whatever it is now being added to streaming platforms, it's very clear that to achieve that level of scale, not all of this is actual production, recorded studio musicians and, an actual artist creating new songs. Some of it is just industrial scale noise being created purely for the purpose of fraud. So I think the AI wave, revolution, whatever you want to call it, it's here to stay. There will be a number of legitimate companies in the space that do great work, but we will be ever vigilant about, the ill effects of the same products.
I love the idea of treating this as a volume thing, whereas as an artist, if you've been at it for 40 years, you might have 20 albums or something times 12 songs. That's the benchmark. You can't have 100,000 songs. It's not possible. So maybe there's something there. Maybe as an artist, if you use AI, if you're an AI artist, whatever, there's a certain limit of content you should be allowed to create or something like that. That would make it fair for everybody else too. There's this thing in the music industry where, we go to see shows because we want to experience something. We want to feel emotion. AI can sort of manipulate this idea of musician, you're there, you feel something. Whereas when it's created in volume, there's just not the same. It's just not the same appealing.
No, totally. I can tell you a funny anecdote just about something we stumbled across a few weeks ago. One of our researchers was doing some work on, looking for suspicious artists and stumbled across a 1970s Brazilian crooner named Joe Yusube, which has verified profile on multiple streaming services, has a lyrics page on Genius, has an Instagram account with pictures from concerts in the 70s, has a whole backstory around his sort of, peak of his prowess in Brazil in the, 70s and 80s, which is entirely fabricated. And the only reason we know that is because the lyrics happen to be in Hebrew. And our researcher is Israeli and said, what? Wait a second. This is a 1970s Brazilian crooner singing in Hebrew? This doesn't make any sense. And so that's when they started digging. And the funny thing is, I'm not actually sure in this case if the Joe Yusube was intended to be streaming fraud, because he does have a lot of streams and a lot of monthly listeners on platforms, or if it was just Stuff One's really interesting creative project that they decided to do and make this backstory.
Yeah.
But it's illustrative of the lengths which people will go to create interesting, compelling backstories that are also fictitious.
Yep.
And also the ease with which you can do it. Because I don't think it took some effort, but it's getting easier and easier to fabricate all of the elements of that story. So if you want to have 1,000 Joe Asubis with 1,000 backstories and 1,000 Instagram pages, it's not a day's work, but it's certainly not a lifetime's work either.
Exactly. Yeah. With generative AI, everything is so much faster. It's just crazy. I guess like the good segue into like, how do you see Beatdapp in 5 years? Like where like in your vision with like, I understand like everything's changing. It's hard to like, I'm sure you'll be like, we'll see in 2 years, but like, what's your dream in 5 years for the company?
I want to be the standard for the industry. Fraud is a problem that's not going away.
Aren't you pretty much there? If you have like 50% of the streaming that went through, I mean, it's pretty good.
50% to go. But yeah, there's that to me, I think is the sort of first priority. Right.
Yeah.
And obviously for us, it's beneficial because it means we're a bigger business and we have more market share. But I think holistically for the industry, it's also good because there is a comfort in knowing that balls and strikes are being called fairly across every sort of vertical and every platform.
Big priority for the industry. So like, it's great to be there at this time.
Yeah. So that's where I would start. I mean, then what else can we do with either the knowledge that we have and the understanding from our customers of other problems that need to be solved? And I won't, go through the whole roadmap, but there are full of things that are sort of top of mind for us in the years ahead that we want to build. But I think as you sort of speak with founders and you have a founder CEO as well, like you'll know that being distracted too soon by something else is also a very dangerous thing for an early stage company. And we're very fortunate to be, I think, over the quote unquote early stage hump. But I'm very mindful, and Andrew and Poria, my other co-founder, are super mindful that we do want to keep our attention and our eye on the ball up until the point where unequivocally we have won and we are the standard. And once you win a market, you then have to protect it. And so for us, we're also, looking around the corners to see who's maybe thinking a streaming fraud thing sounds kind of interesting. I'd like to, dip my toe in that water. And we certainly want to keep all those folks out. So you're sort of always both, aggressively pursuing being bigger, being the best, defining a category, and then winning the whole thing, and also protecting your flanks from, folks who are thinking about coming into your market.
Can I ask you a question? It's a little bit unrelated, but a little bit related.
Yeah.
You're doing this all and you're based out of Vancouver, not traditionally a music city. It might be known for like, X-Files being filmed there 20 years ago, TV and stuff, somewhat of a tech scene, but, you're fairly close to, San Francisco. You want to set the standard for how this is handled, and you're setting it from a different, from Vancouver. What's special about working with the crew there out west?
In case there are any Vancouver music scene listeners, I will defend that Vancouver has a fairly vibrant and exciting music theme. And it was just out there last week, and we actually did a company battle of the bands with some local artists that were awesome. So there is a music scene there, but truthfully, I was living in LA when we started the company, but my co-founders, Andrew and Poria, were both in Vancouver. And there were a couple things that we knew for sure. One, Canada can be a very friendly place if you know how to navigate it to start a company. I know that sometimes doesn't come through in the press, and there are certainly some things that are happening right now that make it a little harder to start a company. But generally, if you know how to navigate the R&D credits and some of the other things, there are some advantages to forming a startup in Canada. The second thing is we knew the Vancouver tech scene, and it's really strong. And we knew that there were a lot of very high performing technical folks in Vancouver, or who would happily move to Vancouver if they were somewhere much colder, like, Waterloo or Montreal or anywhere else. And so we thought we would have a bit of a recruiting edge, and we all three of us had a network in Vancouver that we could pull from. And so that was really it. It wasn't any one specific reason. It was a few, in retrospect, I think were the right ones. I mean, we're now 50 people, 46 of whom are in Vancouver, and our technical team is second to none. I would put them up against anyone that I've ever worked with, from our head of data science, who we pulled in from a PhD program in Calgary, to the folks who lead our data engineering and ML and DevOps teams. Like, they're just rock solid and incredibly loyal to the company and to the mission. If I could do it all over again, There are certainly lots of things that we would do differently along the way, but forming the company in Vancouver and recruiting out of the Vancouver tech scene, that's a no-brainer. I would do that every day.
That's fantastic. And I guarantee that you have a fantastic company ski team if you wanted to put one together.
Oh, we would be awesome. Hockey too. I think our CFO is a pretty mean hockey player, and one of our full stack devs is definitely a pretty mean hockey player. So I think we'd be dangerous on skates.
Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. We're getting close to, we're actually a little bit beyond our target. Like, how do we wrap this up? What's the challenges that you're super excited to solve in the next few months, and then where we should be hearing from or about Beatdapp in the next year or so?
I think in the next few months, we've done a couple of deals this year with sort of collection societies like CMO, PRO types. So we announced the MLC and also Sound Exchange. I think that's a market that we really haven't tapped into globally yet, and I would love to. So I hope you hear more from us in that space. There are a lot of collection societies that can definitely use our help, and I think we have a pretty strong business case now with those two new clients. I think you'll see more from us in streaming services and just adding more services to the fold. Yeah, I think this is one of those problems that, like I said, it's not going away. And I think the thing that's super motivating, aside from having a passion and heart for artists, is also knowing that you have a motivated, sophisticated adversary on the other side who is looking at everything you do and trying to figure out how to game it. And so there's this level of, like, I think it's very intellectually stimulating for the team. I think it's, very motivating because if you let up, they will find holes and they will exploit them. And so that is a good problem to have, because it means that you're always having to push the boundaries of, like, what new technology can we use, from graph network analysis to community detection models, you name it. Like, there's always something new coming out in the sort of leading edge of machine learning that we can apply. And so I think from a business standpoint, let's continue to grow the customer base. Let's make all the customers we have incredibly happy. Let's protect the industry. It's just continuing to allow the 1,000-pound brain, super high horsepower technical folks that we have to apply the latest and greatest to solving this problem and to meet the ever-changing nature of fraudsters.
Laser focus on the mission. I love it. I think the future is bright for Beatdapp. We'll be glad to be a partner within that journey. I'm sure we'll cross paths in the future. Our two companies dovetails really well together. Super excited about the future for you guys. Morgan, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll catch you later.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.